No matter where we live, in the city or the country, we must be ready all the time to do the right thing. Yes, we must all get ready now.
Hello and welcome to my first video on my channel, Conscious Doom. I am going to be taking a look at my Cyberdeck build. If you don't know what a Cyberdeck is, it's basically kind of a miniaturized computer, and it's got quite a community built up online these days. My Cyberdeck build is based on a couple designs, the primary one being Jay Dozier, who I'm hoping to get his name correct, who runs back7.co, and also Evan Meany, who also has a blog, and I will link to their respective websites. So I used them as kind of a lot of inspiration and as a resource to build mine, and I'll be doing multiple videos on this Cyberdeck. This first one is just kind of a show and tell. I will go through the features and the purpose behind it, and in future videos I will talk about the build itself, the components, the wiring, all those good aspects that are a lot more technical in detail. So this one is, as I said, much more a show and tell, and just kind of going through the features and the purpose behind this build. To give a bit of background, I actually wanted to start this build all the way back in November of 2019, and I actually started building it right around April of 2020, so right as the world was going through the disease that shall not be named on YouTube, but the beer virus, as it is commonly called. And everyone's sitting at home, sheltering in place, and it felt like the end of the world, certainly. So what better time to build an end-of-the-world Cyberdeck? So mine is really built around the concept of what would you need to kind of rebuild society and survive if you had a computer that had information on it. So we'll go through that piece, but we'll start right here with this box. I will say this Cyberdeck is themed after The Division, the video game The Division from Ubisoft. Have two statues here to represent that, as well as the logo on the front for the Strategic Homeland Division from the game. But it is basically just a standard cardboard box, except that it has, starts right here with this nice little braided copper cable, which attaches into the inside of the box as a grounding source for the copper lining. Now this copper lining is basically to run the rough concept of a Faraday cage. It's going to, in theory, capture solar flare energy and convert the currents that would normally damage electronics into something that can just be grounded out, and thereby, in theory, protecting the contents inside. And going inside the box, which we will set to the side, we have what looks like a pretty standard Pelican case. I got it in olive drab green, or kind of a ranger green color, kind of my preferred end-of-the-world survivalist color for pretty much everything that I own. And it's a standard Pelican case, not really modified on the outside at all, so it maintains its water tightness and its weather resistant aspects, some shock proofing. But really what's awesome is when you get into the inside. So it actually opens upside down, but inside is the Cyberdeck itself, the miniature computer. And so we're going to take a close look at the features and what's contained in this kit as it is right here opened, and then we'll turn it on and we'll go through what I have in the Cyberdeck itself. So the very first step of looking at the Cyberdeck is to look at the items that come with it. Just kind of go through each item and its purpose. The first of which is this small little Ethernet cable. And this is specifically designed to be able to connect the Cyberdeck via its Ethernet port to the network switch that is on board. That way the Cyberdeck can actually serve as a web server to other devices that can be connected to it and transfer data and information. So that's the entire purpose of that, is just to get internet connectivity, as it were. The next item up is a pretty standard USB braided cable, USB 3.0, but that doesn't really matter because this is only supplying power. It's a 6-foot braided cable. This is the little power brick, so it's USB based, and it's what's important with it is the power voltage and amperage, that it matches what the Cyberdeck expects, which is to say 5 volts and roughly 3 amps. So it's a pretty standard, tight, compact little power brick, which is packed in there as well. We also have this Survivor, it's Corsair Survivor 128 gigabyte USB thumb drive. The concept of this thumb drive is that it is aluminum housing and it is watertight, so that it is pretty much well and truly weather resistant. It's got some drawbacks if you look at reviews online, but the idea is that it can survive a bit. And the purpose behind this is kind of the disposable storage medium. There's a lot of important stuff housed in the onboard storage for the Cyberdeck, but if you wanted things that weren't quite as vital for, say, survival, such as movies or music, entertainment of some kind, you can put it on this and have that in addition to everything else. You can watch movies on the Cyberdeck if you really wanted to, but again, it's disposable. If you lose this or if it gets damaged, it's not the end of the world. Next, we have a USB GPS device. There's a lot of different versions out there. I went with this one because it's pretty compact. It's got its drawbacks. It has to have direct exposure to the skyline in order to get signals from the GPS satellites. But this is necessary to work with the mapping software if you want to get any type of geolocation. And it works pretty well, and we'll go through a demo of that later. And finally, we have this small little USB device. This one is currently not used by this Cyberdeck, but I have plans for it long term. This is a USB microphone. The idea is that you could maybe use this Cyberdeck as some sort of universal translator. There is software out there today that can, much like Google Translate or something, can accept verbal language, convert it to text, do a translation on the text, and to bring that from text to speech. Currently, that software isn't supported on Raspberry Pi, but once that is the type of thing I will put on this Cyberdeck. And that's it for the devices that are included in the Cyberdeck, and then we can talk about the deck itself. All right, so talking about some of the at-a-glance features of the Cyberdeck before we power it on, we'll go through some of the components you can see just right here visually. The keyboard is a Plank EZ keyboard. The reason I chose it is it's just the right dimensions to fit in a Pelican case. Has a lot of features and a lot of customizability. It is one of the more expensive components that goes into the Cyberdeck, but I think it's well worth the money. It is an ortholinear keyboard, which means that all the keys are directly in a line, but it also ensures it can fit in this very small footprint. It is a USB-C based connection that actually feeds right back through this front I/O panel, goes directly into the Raspberry Pi that is the brains of this box. So it is a standard connection and uses up one of the USB ports for Raspberry Pi. The front panel here has a lot of features, so we're going to go through them left to right and just talk about them. So you have two USB ports. These are for power. The top one is for external power source. So I mentioned the braided cable, USB cable like this, that would plug into that external power port in order to supply power from an actual outlet, a wall outlet, or it could be any type of battery power source or even solar power source, but it is external to this box itself. The second cable or the port is for the same cable, but to charge the onboard battery. So you can charge the battery, but not really while you are actually powering the Cyberdeck. It's kind of a drawback of the battery I'm using, but it is a source to actually do charging without having to take apart the entire Cyberdeck. So external power, battery charging. The switch that's right next to it is a toggle between the external power and the battery power. So it's currently set to external power, which means it's not getting anything because nothing is plugged in. If I were to set it to switch down to battery power, it would immediately send power from the battery bank that's on board on the inside of this case to all the components that I have switched on, which they are all currently switched off, but we'll talk about it. I will note that all the text, all the raised lettering on this I/O port is printed in glow-in-the-dark filament, so it actually has a little bit of a glow if you're using it in a low-light situation. It is the only piece that is glow-in-the-dark. All the rest of it is a different type of filament that I used to 3D print. Of course, we have the USB cable, USB-C cable for the keyboard coming in. Don't have that marked because it's kind of a standard expected port. So then going along the top with these switches, again, we have the power, but when we have the Raspberry Pi switch, so when it's in off position, there's no power going to the Raspberry Pi. Next is the display. When it's off, there's no power going to the display. And the last one is the switch. When it's off, there's no power going to the switch. We also have an auxiliary audio channel. It's stereo that goes basically a pass-through to the Raspberry Pi. So if you want to be able to plug in headphones, it's a pretty standard 3/4 inch jack there. Next we have a mil-spec 6-pin circular connector. I based this mainly on the Jay Dozier design because he used the mil-spec connectors. I like the way it looked, but it's also functional. This is currently wired into the Raspberry Pi to basically act as a serial connection. It is something that can be rewired manually. If you're to open up the box, you can change the pin out, but currently it is set up for some sort of serial connection. Next we have 3 USB ports. These are standard pass-throughs to the Raspberry Pi. So standard Raspberry Pi has four USB ports. We are using one for the keyboard, the other 3 are pass-throughs. 2 of these are USB 3, and then the last one is USB 2.0. That is just the way the Raspberry Pi is set up. I don't actually recall which one is which, but you can figure it out if you go into software, try to plug in devices. The main point though is that you have the ability to support at least 3 additional USB devices just straight off the I/O panel. And finally, you have an Ethernet jack, which is a pass-through to the Ethernet on the Raspberry Pi. As I mentioned before, you can take this little Ethernet connector, and if you were to connect it into that and up into the switch, you can now serve as a web server off of this Cyberdeck. So that is the I/O port for this Cyberdeck and all the features of it. Next up, we have a 7-inch Raspberry Pi touchscreen. Chose a touchscreen so I didn't have to have any type of keyboard or mouse peripheral near my keyboard. Everything that can be done as a mouse can be done with the touch, and I have it configured to use long touch and 2-finger touch for various right-click and click and drag type commands for a mouse. And finally, we have a network switch, standard Netgear 4-port plus 1, so it can act as just a general network switch, and it is powered off of the same thing as all the rest of this. And so we're going to plug it up and turn it on, and I'll toggle the switches and talk about it as we go. So let's plug this up. And now I'm going to plug this into the external because I want to power it via external. And once I plug that in, now I have power running. Now everything else is turned off, so nothing is happening. But you'll see if I turn my network switch on, there it goes, it's turning on. Now I don't really have a reason to have that on right now, so I'm going to turn it back off. So the next step is to turn on the display. Usually display first, then Raspberry Pi. That's just based on how the display likes to start up. So I'll turn on the display and the Raspberry Pi, and you'll see it go into its boot cycle. So I'll note a couple things about this. You'll see this little lightning bolt in the top corner. That's because the Raspberry Pi 4 draws a lot more power than can actually feasibly be supplied. That's a regret I have with the design of this Cyberdeck. I actually do plan on going back and replacing the Raspberry Pi 4 with a Raspberry Pi 3 because the Raspberry Pi 3 draws a whole lot less power and it still has all the features that I would need. So I'm just noting that as there are future things that I plan on doing to the Cyberdeck to make it better in the future. Now that it's powered on and booted into the operating system, you can see that I have customized it a bit to look, again, that Division theme. I have the SHD logo in the background. I also have this orange ring as the start menu icon, which is kind of significant to the aesthetic of the Division games. And on that start menu, I also have the Cyberdeck displayed with a nice little icon for the Survivor logo from the game, which is like a little wolf icon. And in that little menu is links to the pieces of software we're going to talk about. But I also have them up in the taskbar as well as on the desktop to be quickly touched and referenced and launchable. So the first one we're going to talk about is this one, which is Foxtrot GPS. This is GPS software. It's really awesome software, really flexible and usable. And it basically works on the same map tiling system as most other GPS mapping software, things like Google Maps and some of the other open source, OpenStreetMap and those types of things. What I have done in order to make sure this is usable when you don't have an internet connection is I have made offline copies of a large volume of map tiles at various resolutions. As you can see, we're actually currently looking at New York, and we can zoom in and out of kind of this street view. We can also swap over to other views. let's see here. There we go. Like, here's a satellite view of New York. And these are pretty high resolution. What I've done is I've captured all of the United States at varying levels of resolution, but not super depth, because just the amount of data you'd have to keep stored for the entire United States. But I did capture every major city that has a population greater than 1 million, has high resolution map tiles, and the southeast region of the United States, of which I live, is a much higher resolution captured. Again, a lot of data for all that. And the specific location that I live in has a lot more of that high resolution data. So it's very useful where I live, less so the further I get out of the southeast. But certainly every major city in the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, are actually captured here. So this could be taken pretty much anywhere in the greater 50 states and be completely functional from a mapping system. As you can see, because it's GPS, we could actually plug in this GPS dongle, and if we had a view of the skyline, it could capture the satellite signals. It would be able to geolocate us, and that would be usable not only for seeing where you are, but being able to then determine where you might want to go. The Foxtrot GPS software allows for some basic waypointing, tells you distances, and allows you to kind of track your progress. So it's a great piece of software. I highly recommend you look up Foxtrot GPS. Works great on Raspberry Pi. And again, really the power of this, beyond just the wonderful software for Foxtrot GPS, is also just the storage of all these map tiles to make them usable in an offline mode. So if I'm out in the middle of nowhere with no internet connection, out in the middle of the woods, I can still pull up nice satellite views and street views of surrounding cities. With that, we'll talk about the other piece of information we have stored here, which is the knowledge base. So the knowledge base is basically just a really complex website that's been set up. And the way this is done, it's all served off of the Cyberdeck. I've opened up multiple tabs of it, but as you can see, I have it again themed after the division, calling it the SHD knowledge base. Really, it's just a link to a bunch of things. The first link is for the wiki repository, so it's a lot of offline wikis such as Wikipedia. The next one is the PoleShift repository. That is a now defunct website that was a repository for a bunch of survivalist information and kind of society rebuilding information. After that is the Survivor Library, which is a very large repository of similar information to PoleShift. And finally, I have a couple of other resources that are just kind of generically linked. And the last link is for an information sheet for the Easy keyboard from Plank, because this is actually a rather complex keyboard and you need some reference information for it. So there's a reference sheet linked there. It's a basic PDF. So if we first look at the wiki repository, as you can see, there's a lot of different wikis that are available here. The first one is Wikipedia. That is all of Wikipedia, including images, as of, I believe, the early part of 2020. So it is very up to date. And this is just so you have all of the world's information, as much as you can really kind of gather together. It's, I think it's something like 80 gigabytes of raw website information of Wikipedia. Next, we have ArchWiki, which is a Linux reference wiki. So you're on a Linux system, you need to be able to reference Linux-based things. You have that. Have the Raspberry Pi Raspberry Pi Stack Exchange, so you can reference things for the Raspberry Pi as a platform. You have WikiVoyage, which is the kind of call it encyclopedia of locations, so you can get more detailed information about locales that you might be going to. We have the Project Gutenberg Library, which is all of the now out of copyright, public domain books that are English text, so pretty much anything that's older than probably the 20s and maybe 30s is available in Project Gutenberg, and maybe even some things that are more modern that have been allowed to be put on there. So you got a lot of reading material for both entertainment and for knowledge. And then finally you have gardening and landscaping, kind of a similar Stack Exchange thing, so you can reference people's thoughts, kind of historically, questions that might be asked. Again, useful if you need to know how to care for plants and whatnot. Going back to the baseline of the knowledge base, we'll go into the pole shift repository. So as you can see, there's a lot of topics here. Everything ranging from how you do agriculture to maybe some diseases or how to act like a doctor. A great example would be if there's a woman going into labor and you've never done that before, you can reference things for like midwifing and the details of that, so you would actually have an idea of how to handle that type of situation. So all sorts of pieces of information that's useful here, both for immediate survival needs as well as society rebuilding. Going back again, we can also check out the survivor library. It's basically a lot of the same type of thing once it loads, except it's much more extensive. It's got a lot more links, but as you can see, it's similar subjects. You can see beekeeping is one of them. You have things on berries and fishing and forestry. Again, medicine, etc. This one has also a lot more of governmental concepts, how to kind of reestablish government for societal rebuilding. Got some pretty interesting reading there. All of these link to big books in PDF form that can be utilized. Again, we have other repository information, which are just kind of a dump of PDFs that don't belong in either the pole shift or in the survivor library. So that's it. And again, I'll click real quick on the link for the Plank keyboard layout information, so you can actually see what the layout is, how it changes based on the commands you send it. So it's a pretty useful keyboard. It's actually one of the reasons I wanted it, and but it's also complex enough that you need a reference. So that's the knowledge base, and on board this Raspberry Pi is 512 gigabytes of space, and nearly all of that is used up simply by this knowledge base and the mapping software. Those two things have used up all but I think about 80 gigabytes of the storage space. And that last 80 gigabytes might be used for some other minimal things down the road. But that's it. That is all this Cyberdeck really contains currently. I'm certainly open if anyone has ideas for things that I should include in my Cyberdeck in terms of future revisions of updating the data on this Cyberdeck. Let me know. Put it in the comments below. I would love to add and make this more feature-rich. But currently, it is really meant to just pack up really easily, taken anywhere, survive a bit of a journey, and be usable as a resource for any number of topics, and as well as finding where you are on a map or being able to research a location you're going to be going to. Beyond that, there really isn't much more to say about the Cyberdeck itself, and so I'll just go ahead and shut it off, and we'll talk about the rest of it in future videos.